Hannah.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. In my beautiful office.
Beautiful office. I can see the green trees outside your window. Nice view.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Shall we try sharing screen? Oh,
Sure.
wait, no, it says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Oh, let me see. Okay, I'm switching that right now. So you should be able to share it as of now.
Okay. Let's see.
Yay.
Yay. All right. There. Whoops. Except maybe we should go to the first slide instead of the last one. I don't know
why.
So cool.
I'm so excited.
Oh, good. And thanks. I saw that you downloaded the document. Now, it is Jacob. Jacob's the one who co-hosts these with you, right?
Yes, and
okay.
he generally goes by Jake, I think, but maybe Jacob as well. I call him Jake. And he'll be joining us any moment. And I can see from my end that we already have, I think, like 5 people in the audience who are just waiting.
Awesome.
So hi, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
We'll get started shortly.
Hey, I wanted to see if this, not to give everybody the big reveal or anything, I wanted to make sure that this video plays. Are you seeing a video on?
It's kind of moving slowly, but I do see movement.
Okay. It's, I mean, big reveal for the participants who are already on the meeting. Not a lot happens. So it's slow science.
Cool.
But okay. As long as the video is playing, then that's all I really wanted to make sure of.
I think you're good then.
Okay, is my sound all right?
Your sound is really good. Yeah, at least on my end it is.
Okay, good. Yay. All right.
Yeah. Cool. Oh, here comes Jake.
Okay, cool.
Hey, Jake. Jake, this is Hannah.
Hi, Hannah. I'm Jake.
It's good to meet you.
Good to meet you too. What a fantastic photograph. Oh my goodness.
Wow. Hopefully there's more to come.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, by the way. I'm looking forward to this. This should be fun.
Oh my gosh, we are so happy to have you. And I've heard a lot all day about the anticipation for this. So I can speak for my local friends. A lot of people are looking forward to this.
Oh, good. Great. Well, and I told Lander earlier, this is about a 35-minute talk. And so I don't know how the Q&A usually goes, but that should give us a fair amount of time.
Yeah. There's, we kind of designate the hour just for a placeholder, but if we go over a little bit, if we're under a little bit, there's absolutely no problem there. So
right. Awesome.
Just happy to have you.
Yay. Fabulous.
Yeah, once the hour hits, Hannah, we'll do a little introduction and tech housekeeping, and then we'll hand it over to you.
Okay, that sounds great.
How's everyone doing on this rainy day?
Good. I'm really happy that it's raining, actually. The garden really needs it.
Saves me some time getting out there and watering. Absolutely.
I was kind of surprised. I didn't think we were supposed to get any rain out of this. I thought that it.
Yeah.
Just gonna.
I thought it was going to wait until tonight, like all through the evening. I didn't realize it was going to come on so early, but I'll take it.
Yeah, exactly. We will. Like you said, Lander, our gardens all need it.
Yes. Anne from our audience just said she loves the rain as well. She has attended pretty much all of our webinars, so welcome back again, Anne. We're so happy you're here.
Yay. Fabulous. Hey, this should be good. So I was thinking about this. So Lander, originally I had said, oh, is this something where I go out in the field and then I sort of take a camera and I talk to people while I'm in the field? And as I was driving over to the library for better internet, I thought, I'm so glad that this is not go in the field and talk to us from the field, because you know, I'm sure it would have worked, but I would be wet.
Mhm.
So,
Yep, I think this is one of the very first days that we've had this kind of wet weather for our program. Usually it's super sunny and we're like really grateful that people are showing up, but assuming that people are going to want to be outside instead.
Yep. Yeah. I would have been glad if it were a sunny day. I would have been right out there. I would have been perfectly happy to be like a reporter in the fields.
Another time we'll do it that way.
That's right. Yeah.
We'll just give folks just a couple more minutes to slowly trickle in.
Yes, sounds good.
Lander, is your cat fed? No.
Yes,
We
both
anticipate no
kitties are fed, and I actually put them up in the bedroom and closed the door because they've been a little bit of a nuisance today.
They can't help themselves?
They can't help themselves. It can be very cute and then also very distracting.
Yeah.
What about yours?
He is gonna just wait. He's fine, but he is also downstairs, so. If I feed him too early, he just like 10 p.m. rolls around and he's like, is it time for breakfast?
Yep, it's funny. The home office is definitely a funny situation.
It is. We are living in unique times, aren't we?
Yes.
So I've like, wow, almost like 10 more people have tuned in the last like 5 minutes or so. It's 4 o'clock. Should we just do like a very slow entry? Lander, do you want to start?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody who's joined us so far. We're super excited. I think this is our 8th webinar in the series Friends from the Field, which is co-hosted by Blue Hill Heritage Trust, a community-based conservation organization for the Blue Hill Peninsula, and Island Heritage Trust, which is a land trust for Deer Isle, Stonington, and the surrounding islands. We're super excited about our topic today, and I'm going to introduce Hannah in just a moment. In the meantime, if you have logged on and you'd like to share in the chat box, which is at the base of your screen, there's a little bubble, I think, that designates the chat box, if you're familiar with that. You could enter your name, where you live, and maybe a reason why you joined us tonight. It's kind of a nice way to know who's showing up for this online gathering. And I think at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Jake for a little tech housekeeping, and then we'll introduce Hannah.
Thanks, Lander. Hi, everybody. I'm Jake. So there's a couple of features I just want to point out to everyone. I believe at the bottom of your screens, there should be a raise your hand button. So that gives you the option at the end of the presentation. You can tune in and speak to Hannah directly, either via your audio or your video and audio. I think you have both choices. Please feel free to check in with us via chat box throughout the presentation if you have questions. We'll wait until the end. We'll let Hannah go through her presentation in full, and then we'll have a Q&A section at the end. So if you can wait, great, but if you're too excited and you're in fear that you're going to forget the question, go ahead and drop it in the chat box, and Lander and I will get together at the end and go through and try to get through all of them and let Hannah have a moment to answer them. So without further ado, I'll hand it back to Hannah, and she can properly and formally to Lander, and she can properly and formally introduce Hannah, our guest.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake. So we're so excited to have Hannah Weber with us today. She is the Marine Ecology Program Director at Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park, and she is also a Blue Hill Heritage Trust board member. Thank you, Hannah, so much. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Cool. Thanks, Lander, and thanks, Jake. How does this sound? You can just give me a thumbs up, Lander or Jake. Great. Awesome. So hi, everyone that I can't see, but I know you're out there. And thanks, Lander and Jake, for the invitation and the introduction. Again, I'm Hannah Weber. I'm the Marine Ecology Director at Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. Schoodic Institute is, I need to figure out how to forward my slides. There we go. Schoodic Institute is a nonprofit partner to Acadia National Park. We're dedicated to pursuing solutions to environmental challenges through the integration of research, education, and conservation. I study rockweed ecology. We'll meet rockweed in a few minutes. Throughout the state of Maine as part of a UMaine-led research effort called Conserving Rockweed Animal Systems for Sustainable Harvest, or CRASH with 2 S's. And you can learn more about that project at our project website. If you just Google CRASH with 2 S's, you'll be able to find out more about that. So how does, one moment, I am in my car and I have this friend who has told me that she can eat her noodles with chopsticks while she's in her car driving. And I figure if she can do that, I can give a presentation in my car. So I just wanted to orient everybody to my surroundings. Anyway, how did someone get curious about rockweed ecology and enough so to pursue it as a research career? Speaking from my experience, but not everybody's, you spend a lot of time in the intertidal zone in Maine, first with my siblings and my cousins growing up in Casco Bay, and then with fellow naturalists when I was a bit older, working around Mount Desert Island and the Blue Hill Peninsula, and now messing about still with the intertidal and with seaweeds with my fellow researchers from Casco Bay to Cobscook Bay, so almost the entirety of the coast of Maine. I figured, since that's where I have most of my experience, that that's where we would spend most of our time. That's where we would begin and spend most of our time today, in the intertidal. I wanted to give a quick outline of today's talk. We'll talk about seaweed biology, and then, because I really did think this was friends from the field, I figured we would take a walk down to the shore. And we'll go exploring some of the sites that we have in our area on the Blue Hill Peninsula and down on the islands. Then we'll come back from the shore and talk about how humans use seaweed, and then we'll finish up with a little bit of seaweed in art. I would love to say that whether it's, Bard Island or Scott's Landing or Carter Nature Preserve or, the Snow Natural Area or any of the other of the Trust's locations, we can all get down to see some seaweed. And I just love this quote from E.O. Wilson that I'll share here. Mysterious and little known organisms live within walking distance of where we sit. Splendor awaits all of us in minute proportions. So with that, we'll jump right in. And I want to say that we usually are visiting the intertidal at low tide. So I figured while we're still getting settled, maybe we forgot to turn off a burner or something like that. It happens. That we would see the intertidal at high tide. Here's a quick video. It's 1 minute, 12 seconds. So not very long at all, but I figured this would help us sort of settle into seaweeds. The sound is really low. You would have to really turn up your speakers to hear it. All right, thanks for humoring me. So, okay, we saw some floating seaweed, and we saw some seaweed that are glued to rocks, and some floaty things that could be phytoplankton, but are more likely to be, among other things, crushed up pieces of seaweed. We move on to the next slide here. But I thought we should probably pause here for a second and stop ourselves and say, wait a second, what is seaweed? It seems like kind of a good basic place to begin. And so we're going to talk about seaweed biology, but before we do that, we need to take a step back and talk about algae, because all seaweed are algae, but not all algae are seaweed. So I thought we should start there. So here's our big old tree of life. And if we look at the tree of life, we can see that sort of plants are all out on one branch, all by themselves. And for orientation, we're down here with other animals. So we're here. Here's plants up in the upper right. But we can see that algae are actually all over the tree of life. They're not just green. In fact, algae are not green plants. They're a lot of other things, but they're not green plants. And so algae is kind of a catch-all phrase. I thought we would put up a picture of a plant, since often we think of algae as plants, even though they're not, and we'll sort of talk through how it is that they're not plants. And so we have a plant, a tomato plant on one side, and we have sort of some different algae on the other side. And first, I wanted to say that, maybe it's a little unfair. I've given one image of a plant and several images of algae, and that's because maybe I'm probably being a little unfair from my point of view. But the point is that plants are these multicellular organisms, and algae aren't. They can be unicellular, they can be multicellular, they can be anything. Plants have a vascular system, that tube-like system for moving water and nutrients throughout the organism. Algae don't. They don't have a vascular system, no tubes. Instead, each and every cell of an algae has to obtain its own nutrients from water to survive. Most plants have roots and have cells that are organized into tissues and sometimes into organs. And one plant by itself can have totally different parts, leaves and roots and flowers and fruits and seeds, cones, etc. Algae don't. They don't have that kind of differentiation. Super simple body plans. We won't find an algae with flowers or, multiple different structures. Plants are fixed in place, and some algae are as well, but some float in the water. Others have little flagella and sort of tail-like structures that they use to actively move. And other algae may move by sort of pushing their body forward in a sort of a crawling motion. Plants can have these insane, crazy, cool, complex, multicellular ways to reproduce. I mean, think about flowers. Some of these ways to reproduce, they need wind and they need birds and they need bugs for pollination. Algae doesn't get any of that. Algae comparatively can reproduce through sort of tiny spores or even through replication or growth of broken pieces. Typically, algae are found in water, although you could also find them on land or snow, growing on rocks, growing on marine animals. Algae grows on polar bear fur and also grows on rainforest animals like sloths. So you will find algae in a bunch of different places. And although you might say, aha, but algae photosynthesize, Weber, well, most do, but not all algae even do that. So at the end of the day, what we really are left with is that algae is sort of this catch-all for single and multicellular photosynthesizers and their non-photosynthesizing relatives. These are morphologically body shape, simple, and they have simple sex lives. So those are algae. So what's seaweed? Because really this isn't a talk like what's algae, this is what's seaweed. Seaweeds are algae that we can see. On the tree of life, algae are, again, all over the place. they're not up there with the green plants whatsoever. So they're visible to the naked eye, and typically we consider that there are 3 different types of seaweeds, or they fall into 3 large groups based on the types of pigments they have. We'll start up with the green algae over here. These are the closest to green plants, and they're where we assume green plants evolved from. There's about 8,000 species of 6,000 to 8,000 species of green algae, green seaweed worldwide, and most of them are freshwater. About 90% of them are freshwater. We move over sort of right next door, relatively speaking, to the green algae. We have the red algae, sort of like this Chondrus crispus. Oh, by the way, the example of the green algae is Alva lactuca. We're going to meet that in a minute. So this red algae is Chondrus crispus, and it's sort of right next door. There's about 6,000 to 8,000 species, and most of them, 90%-ish of them, are marine. And then the brown algae, the brown seaweeds, are way over on the other side of the tree of life, like this Fucus spiralis that you'll find in the upper intertidal zone. There's about 2,200 species of brown algae found worldwide. Basically, all of them are marine. So here are seaweeds, again, not plants, algae that we can see with the naked eye. They live all over the world, freshwater, saltwater, and from the shores down, they're really limited in the ocean and in freshwater by how much light there is at depth. So the deepest algae is a red algae that's found at about 300 meters. So give or take somewhere between 900 and 1,000 feet. Again, here in the Gulf of Maine, we have about 250 species of seaweed. I wanted to just talk through sort of the basic seaweed body plan. Here's our basic structure. However, there's enormous diversity, and we'll see that shortly. Down at the base, we've got a holdfast. Again, this is not roots. It's not used for moving nutrients. A holdfast is really a gluing structure, gluing seaweeds down to the rock or material that they're on. There's a lot of research going on in what this glue is, because obviously if you can put something out and glue yourself to a rock, that's kind of a cool, it's kind of a cool material to know about. So lots of research happening around holdfast glue. But moving up, we've got something called a stipe. This, if you were going to translate it into the plant world, you might say, oh, it's just like the stem. It's not, but anyway, so we would call that a stipe. Then up above, we've got blades. Sometimes people call these fronds, and I've heard them called fronds and blades, or leafy things. Don't call them that. Call them blades or fronds. And then often seaweed will also have a float or an air bladder or a vesicle. Altogether, the whole thing is called a thallus. Nobody's going to get quizzed on this. It's okay if you're standing out there, knee deep in a tide pool and you're going, I don't know, it's called something that starts with a TH. Just, I wanted to review the basic body plan so we knew what we were talking about. So now that we know what we're talking about, let's go dig around in some seaweed. I went out to 4 of our different locations around the ones I've already mentioned: Bard Island, Scott's Landing, Snow's Natural Area, and Carter Nature Preserve. All the seaweeds that I show you in the next few slides, you can go and find at least one of these locations. So as we head out on our seaweed adventure, we of course have to step over the rack line. This is the tempest and storm-tossed seaweed. And anyone who's ever been out and found that place on the beach for the perfect towel or blanket location knows that you often have to move aside the rack. And it's dry on top, and you don't really want to, because you know that although it's dry on top, that underneath it's slimy and stinky and bugs jump out, and it's just gross, frankly, and nobody wants to touch it. But this washed up seaweed is this amazing and incredible all-you-can-eat buffet for animals like birds. And it's also used by farmers on their crops. For the birds, they really are eating the bugs that are breaking down the seaweed. And the farmers, well, it's actually the seaweed itself. Seaweed is an excellent soil conditioner, and it is collected all over the state and all over its range in farming. But of course, we don't want to stay here in the rack line for all that long, so we're going to keep going. Here's something. This is Fyra umbilicalis. We find the seaweed, which is a red seaweed, in the upper intertidal zone. This means that when the tide goes out, this is a species that's going to be out of water for a long time. And just think about that. Think about yourself sort of laying on a rock in the sun, several hours, with no water. Remember I said these algae, these seaweeds have to get their water, have to get their nutrients from the water. So they're basically just out of water starving. But like most other species of Fyra, this one, umbilicalis, can lose up to 95% of its cellular water during this daytime low tide. This is also they're being exposed to temperature stress and high light. So it's stressful, and yet here they are. They're tough suckers. I want us to imagine for a second that we would lose 95% of the water in our cells on a regular basis. And basically we would end up looking like these mummies in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. We can't do that. Algae can, we can't. I want to say that you probably know Fyra better as Nori or laver. Usually Nori is made from a different species of Fyra, but here you can use Fyra umbilicalis as Nori. Laver is used to make laver bread, which I have come around to. I certainly wasn't high on it originally. It's made from Fyra and oats and bacon lard. You fry it up. Turn it into little cakes and fry it up. Try it, see what you think. Anyone can post if they have the super best recipe for laver bread in the comments. That'd be awesome. Fyra is an aquaculture seaweed. It's been cultivated at least since the 17th century in Japan and Korea and China, and currently is one of the most important industries in the shallow water areas in all of those countries. And originally, so laver farming depended on getting natural seed called conchospores, because nobody knew about the life cycle of Fyra. In 1949, Kathleen Drew Baker, an amazing British phycologist or algae researcher, discovered that this weird little alga called Conchosalis rosea, totally different seaweed, actually wasn't a different seaweed. It was a life stage of Fyra. And so once she discovered that and shared it with the world, suddenly the aquaculture industry around Fyra was able to really grow in leaps and bounds, knowing how to cultivate, knowing that this other life history element existed for then growing out in aquaculture pens or along ropes. So I just want to say that Nori is found throughout the temperate intertidal around the world. It's been used and eaten traditionally by indigenous people on the east and west coast of the Americas, Canada, Hawaii, New Zealand, and parts of the British Islands, and of course eaten in the countries that I've mentioned already. Okay, we just went to one rock. We got to keep going. So let's keep going. All right, all those little brown things that we see, hopefully nobody's brown colorblind, are snails, and they are munching down on this bright green algae. They're so happy. So I don't think the green seaweed's happy, but the snails certainly are. Green algae, especially in the upper intertidal zone, can be very difficult to tell apart. So I'm just going to talk about two. I'm going to talk about gutweed and sea lettuce. I mean, gutweed. Who wouldn't want to talk about that? They're also called Alva Intestinalis and Alva Lactuca. Here's Alva Intestinalis. We often find this in the upper intertidal. Alva Intestinalis, or gutweed, is a tubular green weed, green algae, and it can withstand an enormous range of conditions. So low salinity, so fresher water, to hypersalinity, low oxygen to higher oxygen, low carbon dioxide to high carbon dioxide. If you're out in the intertidal, and this was taken at Bard Island, you can actually watch photosynthesis in action. If you're sitting here and you notice that there are air bubbles that are popping up in the ulva, you can actually watch these air bubbles release into the atmosphere, and that's oxygen for us and everything else. It's really beautiful to watch. If you reach down and grab this stuff, it's going to feel really squishy because it's hollow green weed. And it's super squishy. When I was a kid, we used to grab hunks of this and throw it at each other, me and my siblings and my cousins. Maybe I shouldn't admit to that. It's a great place to find sticklebacks. If you have a yearning to go and catch little fish and then release them, you can go and find great little sticklebacks, or just watch them. You don't have to catch them. You can find great sticklebacks in the pools where you'll find Alva Intestinalis. Going back to the seaweed, leaving the fish, going back to the seaweed, like other members of the genus Alva, this one, Alva Intestinalis, is a summer annual. It decays and forms these masses of bleached white fronds toward the end of the season. You may have seen that before when you've been out on your walks. In the food world, this is green Nori, and of course, if it's in the food world, it's edible. It's usually used in its dried form. Actually, I have nibbled on some of this in the intertidal. Doesn't taste half bad, but we're going to move on. This is Alva Lactuca. So it's this brilliant green alga, only 2 cells thick. If we think about all those biology classes we took a zillion years ago, and we think about how big a cell is, this is tissue thin, edible, highly edible, eaten all over its range. You can go out and tear off little parts of these fronds and nibble on them in the intertidal. It again is usually used in its dry form, but you can put it in salads and eat it as is. But I want to say, okay, we've seen this tide pool off over there, and we want to get to it, but we have to get across this stuff. This is we gotta go across a lot of this stuff, frankly. This is Ascophyllum nodosum, or rockweed. It's also known as Norwegian kelp, knotted rack, egg rack, Ascophyllum nodosum. It's it's this species that I study, and I realize I'm chuckling because I realize I didn't even bother putting the Latin name in here because I'm like, oh yeah, it's this stuff. So I apologize, and I'll share that later. Rockweed is the dominant seaweed on the rocky shores of the coast of Maine. Its range is limited to the North Atlantic. The interesting thing about rockweed, let me go back, is that it's not only its own thing, it's its own species, but it's also a habitat. At high tide, rockweed, like we saw in the video a little while ago, forms this branching 3D space. Limits light, it creates sort of an upper and a lower habitat. And although it's not a tree, it's not a plant, people do liken these rockweed beds to forests. At low tide, however, all of this rockweed, like I'm walking on in this image, it lays down flat and it traps moisture, and it allows for the animals and algae underneath to not get dried out. It's critically important for that. And I could talk all day about rockweed and its geographic location, etc., but I'm not going to, because we have our eye on that tide pool out there. But I do want to say that rockweed is and has been harvested throughout its range for hundreds of years. It's not something that we eat directly all that much, although I do have to say I've eaten it sort of in its dried and pulverized form, and it tastes just like powdered pesto. It's actually really tasty. But it is an excellent soil conditioner, and it's used in animal feed, and it can be mixed with other seaweeds for human consumption. And it's also in a lot of veterinarian medical products. So there are multiple uses. This is small print. I'm going to read it to you, but this is from a paper from the Boston Herald from 1907. And the date line for the little article that I'm going to read is the date line is June 8th, 1907. And it says, you know, cold lunches and wet to the skin, work for 18 hours a day on an average, and sleep out of doors. How would you like to be a seaweed gatherer? I mean, isn't that a great pitch job? And then it goes on, the smaller print says, farmers in Maine find the marine plant very valuable as a fertilizer. We're going to let them say plant because, you know, this was 1907. But the smaller text goes on to say, the calling of gathering seaweed is one of the hardest known in Maine. The men are wet to the skin all the time. They eat cold lunches. They sleep out of doors. They average to work 18 hours a day. There is an aged and cynical saying common among the Eastern Shore, which relates to how a merciful farmer always sent his hired men to pull rockweed when it rained too hard to work out of doors. Just think about that for a second. The article goes on to say the exact wording is not nice for refined ears, though the idea conveyed requires no explanatory key. The article goes on to say that about 5,000 tons a year of rockweed was pulled from the shores of the Penobscot Bay at this time. So it is something that's was harvested then, and it's harvested now. Anyway, we've gotten to this tide pool that we have been looking at, and it's like, wait, I'm confused. There's lots of things going on here. This is a garden, you know, like the octopus's garden. This is a jungle. You know, we're human. We have land names for seascapes, and I wish we could do better, but we have to roll with this. I think we'll call it a jungle. But we're going to dive in. Up here in the upper left-hand corner, we have Bugis Vesiculosus. This is also called bladder rack. This is kind of flat frond, and that lighter colored sort of line that runs up the center. If we were to run our fingers over that, whoops, I'm moving my camera. It would feel slightly raised. We call it a raised midrib. So this is the identifying feature of Bugis vesiculosus or bladder rack, is that raised midrib. Sometimes we'll find air bladders, those puffy things that are on, they can sometimes show up on either side of that raised midrib. But not always. So really, to identify Bugis vesiculosus, it's better to think about the raised midrib than it is to think about those paired air bladders. This is harvested throughout its range, and it's used in a lot of beauty products as a thickener or an emulsifier. In the Bering Sea on the Commander Islands, some species of Bugis, like people just pull it up and just eat the stipes raw. The stipe, remember, is that part that looks like a stem or a trunk. So I've never eaten Bugis from a tide pool, but maybe I will this summer. Maybe you will, and you'll let me know. But moving on, this is Saccharina latissima. It is a kelp, so it's a brown algae. I should mention that the Bugis vesiculosus is also a brown algae. So this is often more subtidal than intertidal, but we will find it in the tide pools throughout. So this is also called sugar kelp or oarweed sometimes, or seabelt. The mature seaweed of this species can be up to 25 feet long and maybe like 20 inches wide. So it can get to be quite large. It's obviously not the largest kelp in the world, but still pretty impressive when you see it. It's anchored to the rocks by this large sort of branch holdfast. You'll often find them on the shore wrapped around mussel shells. So when they've been torn by storms, the mussel shell will come up with them. Sugar kelp is a part of Maine's extremely active aquaculture scene, seaweed aquaculture scene. There is some research evidence that suggests that co-locating sugar kelp with farmed shellfish like mussels and oysters can change the pH of the seawater and create something like a halo. And this may help mussels and oysters grow better. I wanted, while we're down here in our tide pool, I wanted to look at this, this little pink paint down here. Hope everybody can see that. This is Lithothamnion. There's a bunch of different species of it, which is why we're just going to leave it here. It's at the genus. It's an encrusting Coraline Red Algae. It is a seaweed. It looks like pink paint on the floor of some tide pools. But it's part of a large group of algae or seaweeds called crustose coralline algae, sometimes called CCA. I'm not going to go there today. I'm going to stick with crustose coralline algae. Crustose coralline algae, like this one, are critical to coral reef structure. On coral reefs, the crustose coralline algae act like a cement. They sort of hold the different coral species, together. So when we talk about coral reefs, we're actually talking about sort of coral and coralline algae reefs, just saying. Crustose coralline algae can grow for hundreds of years. And in that growth, they store the record of ocean climate. And so in the Arctic, and also in the waters off of Schoodic, researchers are using subtidal crustose coralline algae to examine ocean chemical conditions on the scale from 100 to like just around 1,000 years. It's a nice gap in our understanding of ocean chemical conditions. But right next to this, we see this other pink algae, this other pink seaweed, and this one is Coraline Officinalis. It's an articulated coralline, and that means, you know, it's got sort of what looks like the ability to bend at all of these little joints. So articulated coralline. We'll find these throughout the North Atlantic, from sort of Norway and actually even down to Morocco and, you know, Greenland, actually to Argentina, all over the place. And the colors are quite varied. Purple, red, maybe even a little bit to the yellowish with white knuckles. You will often find this washed up on the shores in its, you know, after it's died, it's bleached out. I found this to go to about 3 inches in height. So you really kind of have to go looking for it. It's gorgeous when you find it, though. Another thing, going back to our tide pool, that I wanted to point out is this cute little brownish purple thing down here. This is Chondrus crispus, also known as Irish moss. It's iridescent at the tips, and I don't know how many of you have been down to see seaweeds on the shore, and you're like, why is this iridescing? This is so cool. This is the best thing ever. This iridescence at the tips, it's probably for protection, but researchers aren't really sure. But at the tips of these seaweed fronds, there's a protective outer layer, a cuticle, that consists of sort of a bunch of different transparent layers. And when these layers are submerged in water, they sort of bend the light in a way that blue light is reflected. And as a result, we see this iridescence. So the iridescence is not pigment. It's not because of pigmentation. It's really because of the structure of the seaweed. Chondrus crispus is harvested, and Carrageenan is extracted from it. And Carrageenan is used as a thickener and a stabilizer. One of the first uses the first big commercial uses in the 1940s of Carrageenan was in chocolate milk. it actually, added to chocolate milk, it keeps the chocolate from not settling down to the bottom of your chocolate milk. So you get milk and chocolate, instead you get chocolate milk. Nowadays, ice cream, toothpaste uses a beer clarifier used in mayonnaise and still used in chocolate milk, used in diet shakes, etc. It's also the essential ingredient of a pudding called blancmange, and I don't know how many of you have ever eaten that. I kind of like it. It's not for everybody. Some people think it's slimy. But you will also find reference to blancmange in the Canterbury Tales. And so you can find recipes online. This is the recipe that I happen to have: 3 cups of milk, half cup of sugar, and a few small handfuls of dried Irish moss. And this is, you don't have to go and pluck it. You can go back to that stinky rack line, get the nicer stuff. Cook it over boiling water. Don't let the milk boil, and then you remove it, strain it, and add some vanilla and chill it in the fridge. I find it to be delicious. Anyway, so we didn't bring our snorkeling gear, but we'll just play this for a second. But out there, just out of our reach, because we're just not intrepid enough to go into the cold water today, are the kelps. We've already met one of them, the Saccharina latissima, but there's also Alaria esculenta, the winged kelp, Laminaria digitata, which is horsetail kelp, and Agarium cribrosum, or sea colander. They're out there, taking up carbon from the ocean and supporting urchins and fish and shrimp and myriad other species in our cold Gulf of Maine waters. Before we head back from our imaginary seaweed walk, I want to point out this. Oops, I don't want to point that out, although I could, but we're moving on. I want to just point out this floating mat of seaweed out offshore. It's in the upper left-hand corner of the ocean in the picture that you would see on your screen. Storms, and other disturbances will tear seaweed, and the torn seaweed will float with the currents. Some of it, of course, sinks. Most of it floats, and as it floats, it carries and attracts invertebrates and fish and birds. Linda Welch from the Maine Coastal Islands National Wildlife Refuge tells me that there can be miles of these floating islands, and the animals that are associated with them out where the ocean current fronts sort of meet up. And honestly, this is something that as a researcher, I really want to study more. There are other places in the world where we're learning an awful lot about ocean currents by studying the floating and surfing seaweed. This is a southern bull kelp that washes up routinely in Antarctica. And for the longest time, researchers really assumed that Antarctica is kind of, because there's a ring of currents around it that kind of keeps everything out. Antarctica was really considered separate from a lot of other things, and yet bull kelp keep washing up in Antarctica. Really, it's basically like surfing on the water, and we get kelp in Antarctica. So we're learning by studying kelp, we're learning even how currents work. Which is cool. So we're gonna head back. Here's the rack line again. The waters come up almost to the rack line. But I just want to point out, okay, so seaweed is this gorgeous algae, but it also gives a lot of life once it's torn away from itself, out in the sea and up here in the rack. And before we head over the rack, we should probably mention that seaweed, of course, gets eaten by a lot of other species. We already saw some snails, but limpets and chitons and urchins and fish. Different seaweeds have different edibilities. The green seaweed with the snails all around is very edible. Rockweed, is not terribly edible. It's got some really strong anti-herbivory defenses. And of course, we eat seaweed. You know, eating seaweed is global. There's been traditional and novel consumption of seaweed in Japan, Korea, China, Hawaii. Actually, in Hawaii, they used to cultivate seaweed gardens. Seaweed's called limu, and they would have limu gardens. But anyway, it's eaten in France, Ireland, Norway, Iceland, England, Scotland, here in the US, New Zealand, etc., South American countries. Basically, seaweed's eaten everywhere. And why? Well, probably because it's available, but also it's an extraordinary way to eat protein, carbohydrates, fiber, vitamin C, B, A, E, iron, iodine. It also contains a lot of antioxidants. And it's a good gut food. It's got a lot of fiber in it and is good for good gut health. And while we may think about seaweed as something we eat and something that, you know, we have as our wrap on our sushi, it's also used in incredible numbers of different products. This is actually a very old list. This is probably from the 80s, but it always kind of kills me that, you know, even way back in the 80s, you know, seaweed was used for an extraordinary number of things. I mean, babies' rubber pants, go figure. I have singled out this one use over here on the right side of your screen. This is an Aboriginal bark painting, not seaweed. These are delicate, and they're prone to cracking and to splitting. This particular image and about 150 other bark paintings went to China for an exhibit, and the art needed to be stabilized during transport. To stabilize each bark, the museum conservation team used this glue called Nori, which is a Japanese seaweed extract, and it's traditionally used in kimono preservation. So, you know, I think maybe look around and think about where you might not think you'd see seaweed that you probably actually do. Of course, it's also used for fodder, often feeding cows and horses, sheep. You know, there's a lot of sheep out on the Nash Islands to the east of us here in Blue Hill, and the sheep, they're eating the upland greens, but they're also down in the seaweed foraging. Seaweed is also, of course, a fertilizer. It was probably used earlier than the 12th century, but that's when we start getting good records of algae being used as fertilizer in France, Ireland, Scotland, Norway. And of course, not only do we eat seaweed and make incredible products from it, but we also celebrate seaweed with art. We've had some of that sprinkled throughout the slides. And I just want to talk about some of the different art and artists. This is the work of Anna Atkins. I don't think she would have called herself an artist, but I think today we do. She was a Victorian botanist and was the first person to publish a book that was illustrated with photographic images. She created cyanotypes of seaweed and algae, and she really kind of paved the way for the use of photographs in scientific publishing. Her book, she published in 1843, so even that seems a little bit young to be Victorian, but it was a handmade book called Photographs of British Algae, Cyanotype Impressions. And today she's really considered to be the first female photographer, and she's really a pioneer in scientific illustration. So can you make images like this? Yes, heck yes. So I just want to say that if you wanted to make images like this, you totally could. You just need some photoreactive paper and seaweed, and you can capture seaweed in cyanotype. Some of the other art we've seen is from Jennifer Steenboer. She's over in Bar Harbor. Jennifer's doing this. She has been working on this thing called Coast Walk, where she walks around Mount Desert Island collecting stories and images. She uses a light box to capture her images of seaweed. and it's not dissimilar from the work of Josie Islin. Josie is a photographer and a writer. She grew up on the coast of Maine, now lives in San Francisco. Can you make images like this? Sure. So Islin uses a flatbed scanner, and like I said, Jen uses Lightbox. But I mean, you know, so okay, I'm no artist, of course, but you know, you can use a kitchen tub and a smartphone or camera. And then I used an app called Snapseed to make, you know, the top image a little bit tidier. So you can make images like this, and you should try it. Another artist who I really admire is Mimi Carpenter. She's also a Maine artist. Can you do art like this? Heck yes. You know, just grab some art supplies and head on down to the shore. And I want to wrap up with one of my favorite pieces of seaweed art from the late Cape Dorset artist, Kennewick Ashevak. This is Rabbit Eating Seaweed, and it was done in 1959. Just love it. With that, I want to wrap up, and I apologize, I haven't left too much time for questions, but I'm happy to answer any questions. But I do encourage everybody to get out on the shore and explore the seaweeds that we have in our collective backyards.
Wow, Hannah, that was absolutely incredible. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We do have a lot of questions that have poured in through during the presentation. So maybe Jake and I will just alternate and ask the ones that have popped up in the chat box. And if we get somebody wanting to ask you themselves, we'll unmute them for the last 10 minutes.
Sure. I actually took a couple notes as we were going on. Hannah, thank you so much. That was awesome. We have 2 questions from Rob. Are algae under the category of phytoplankton is his first question.
Sure. So phytoplankton are typically, you know, they can photosynthesize, but they're plankton. They're free moving. They are not locked down, and typically they are not visible to the naked eye. So the seaweeds that we've talked about here are visible to the naked eye. I mean, single organisms, we can of course see big masses of them, but seaweeds that we've talked about are visible to the naked eye, and they're mostly attached to something.
Great. And Rob's second question was, what happens to, and forgive me if I pronounce anything incorrectly, but what happens to Fyra during the hard freeze in January?
Yeah, so Fyra is usually, so it can get ripped right off the rocks. There is a lot of evidence that there's a lot of ice scouring events that happen, so it can get torn right off. It can freeze and die, but it's often, sometimes around here, it's expressed as an annual, and so it's wintering in that other life form, so they have an alternation of life. You know, there's alternation, and so sometimes it's in that other form that it's suffering out through the winter.
Great, thanks, Hannah. Lander, do we have anybody queued up for raising their hand?
Let's see. Not that I can see at the moment, but we do have another question from Gina, which is next down the line here. Is any seaweed poisonous?
Oh yeah, good question. Yes and no. So some seaweed, I would say yes, some seaweed are poisonous. And like I would not eat sargassum, and nobody else probably would either. I think what's important is that when you're thinking about seaweed is to think about where it's grown, and seaweed will accumulate heavy metals. And so if you are eating seaweed that is grown in areas with fresh seawater, you know, replacement, you know, constantly flowing water, not near, you know, industrial sources or not near urban sources, then you are very much more likely to be eating good, clean, healthy seaweed. But if the seaweed is grown in areas where there is the possibility of accumulating heavy metals, then yes, you will be eating heavy metals.
That is something. We have a question from Jennifer, and she's asking, what is eel seaweed?
I'm not sure I know. There's eel grass, and eel grass is actually a plant. It is not a seaweed. It grows, it has roots, it has rhizomes, and of course we're worried about eel grass throughout the world because it is, its range is everywhere is shrinking, but it's not a seaweed.
Next question up, I think, is from Margaret. Does Alva Intestinalis occur where the water is calm, but there is a lot of freshwater runoff?
You can totally find it in calm places where there's a lot of freshwater runoff. You won't find it in such a place that it's calm along the shore, such that it's really like muddy or sandy. It really kind of does need that hard substrate to latch onto. But yes, you will definitely find it there.
I think we have somebody whose hand is raised. And if you meant to raise your hand, I'm going to allow you to talk now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I noticed on one of Hannah's slides that there was a list of pharmaceutical uses, and I can't read the things because I'm talking on a cell phone, but I have taken recently a medicine that includes seaweed as a primary ingredient in it because of issues with acid reflux. And it makes a floating island. The seaweed gathers things together, makes a floating island, and doesn't allow the contents that tries to come up. I found that fascinating.
That is very cool.
That's super interesting. Thank you, Anne.
So I think we have another question from Cyrene. She's inquiring about a good field guide or reference book for Maine seaweeds.
Sure. So I love Life Between the Tides by John Mooring, Jill Fegley, and I apologize that I'm blanking on the third author's name. But John Mooring was the primary author. So Life Between the Tides, I've really appreciated. Any of your standard Peterson or Audubon guides will get you there as well. Glenn Middlehauser, who is an extraordinary naturalist who lives up in Goldsboro, is now working. You may know Glenn or his work. He's done Plants of Acadia and Plants of Baxter, and he's actually now working on seaweeds of the Gulf of Maine. So I don't want to put you off, but watch this space because Glenn is working on that is his next book effort. Until then, Life Between the Tides.
Thanks, Hannah.
Yeah.
Jake, we have another hand raised.
Go for it.
I'm allow to talk. Mary, I think you're up.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Hannah.
Hi, Mary.
I had a question around aquaculture with seaweed. I recently heard a presentation that talked about seaweed becoming the new plastic wrap in this whole concept of growing seaweed. Have you explored it all, or is there anything going on with aquaculture of seaweed along the Maine coast?
There's a lot of aquaculture of seaweed along the Maine coast. So there's a lot of different species being grown, a lot of different species being played with. So Sarah Redmond up at Spring Tides, she's up in Goldsboro. She's a good person to talk to about about seaweed aquaculture. You could also reach out to the Maine Seaweed Council. They're an industry group, but they have their hands on the pulse of what's being grown where along the coast of the state of Maine.
I think it's exciting.
I think it's really neat. I think you may have read, some of you may have read last year or the year before at the London Marathon, the packaging for all the water that was at water stops for the marathon runners was actually encapsulated in a seaweed product.
Yeah.
And that was so that it could biodegrade or be cleaned up and you know, landfilled more than, you know, just throwing a whole bunch of water bottles on the side of the road.
I assume for it to be successful, it's a question of currents to bring the nutrients past the seaweed.
Yep,
in these
absolutely.
pens. Yeah.
Totally. Yep.
Thank you, Mary. Looks like we have another question. We have a lot of questions, so we'll get through as many as we can. We might go over like 3 minutes if that's okay, and then we'll figure out another way to answer the rest of the questions. But one of them is, are brown algae capable of photosynthesis?
Totally. Yep. They have so they have chlorophyll A, chlorophyll C, and then they have fucoxanthin, which is another pigment that allows photosynthesis, and beta carotene. So they don't have the same pigment suite that plants or green or red algae have, but they do photosynthesize.
Cool.
Thanks, Hannah. We had a question for you regarding one of the artists' works that you showed. Adrian was questioning what the last artist's name was.
Sure. Oh, let's see. Can I go back there? Yeah.
Yeah, I think
sure. So this artist's name is Kenyuok Ashevek. And so if you needed to do a Google search, you could Google search the Cape Dorset artists. Actually, I can put this in the chat, can't I? The last name is Ashevek. So I already just put the last name in.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Hannah. We also, Valerie asked if David asked if the slides would be available, and David, the webinar will be available for viewing on Blue Hill Heritage Trust's YouTube page after Lander is able to upload it, so you can review the slides then. And then, Hannah, we had another inquiry about the artwork. People really loved that. Valerie was asking about the last two pieces, and if you could give a little bit more information about how they were made.
Sure. This piece is a print. So this is, she's passed now. This is an artist who worked in printmaking and with pencil and paint. I will send Lander the artist's name, and then she can send it out. I see someone has written, sorry, did the artist's name appear? Not seeing it. So, oh, whoopsie, I apologize. So printmaking, pencil, watercolor is the format for this. Oh, thank you very much, David, for putting that up there. And Mimi is an artist using watercolors, other color medium, and pencil and pen.
Really beautiful pieces, Hannah. Thank you for sharing those with us.
Yeah.
Lander, I don't want to be a hog. If you want to recite one of the questions, you go for it.
Let's see. I think the next one is it best dried before eating? This is in reference to a type of seaweed, or can it be fresh? How do you clean and dry it, and how much are we allowed to harvest?
Yeah, good question. So in the state of Maine, first of all, you should definitely get, if you do not own the property, you should definitely get permission from whoever it is whose house this happens to be in front of. The Maine Department of Marine Resources allows 50-pound limit per person. So that's how much you can take. often the seaweed that you will harvest straight from the shore will have epiphytes, things growing on it. And you'll probably want to clean those off. Things like Alva don't have things growing on them. So you wouldn't have to worry about that so much. It really kind of depends on the seaweed. And I don't want to be wishy-washy about this, but it really depends on the seaweed. I would also caution that if you're going to go and do some foraging, that each seaweed grows differently. And so when you're harvesting or when you're foraging, you need to think about how it grows. So if we looked at sugar kelp, for example, it grows actually, so there's a stipe and then there's the blade. And so it actually grows, the grow area there is at the bottom of the blade where the blade meets the stipe. And so if you're cutting above that, then that will still keep growing. If you cut below that, you've just basically, you know, signed a death warrant for that alga. So rockweed will continue to grow as long as there is some green left. It doesn't matter how far down. It's a slow grower, so it does matter, but it will regrow. So anyway, dry or fresh depends on the species. Cleaning, the amount of cleaning you need to do will depend on the species, but it is really 50 pounds for the state of Maine.
Thanks, Hannah. There were a lot of questions about the regulations for seaweed harvesting, and I think you answered all of them. So for the sake of time, I'm going to just skip ahead to a new topic. Forgive me for not, naming out each question individually. Paul had a question about periwinkles. He stated that they are invasive in the intertidal zone, and he was wondering if there's any evidence that they have a negative effect on the seaweed population.
Yeah, sure. So there's 3 species of periwinkles. So there's Litorina saxatilis, Litorina obtusata, and Litorina litorea. It's the Litorina litorea, the common periwinkle, that is the invasive. There's often arguments about whether it is or not. It's been here for a very long time. And I say that because I think that Litorina litorea has been here for so long that we don't have a record of what the seaweed composition of the shores looked like before it was here. So I don't know if it's had such an impact on the seaweeds. I don't know.
Thanks, Hannah.
Yeah.
Another question is how is seaweed farmed commercially?
So it's species dependent. So like kelp, we can grow on ropes. So you can imagine sort of like a clothesline. It's put into a sort of like a soup with sporelings in the soup. And then when the rope is pulled out, the sporelings have attached to the rope. We then put that in the water and it's just grown out on lines. And some other seaweeds need sort of more of like a meshing backing. Dulse is not grown out on these lines. It's grown more on a netting sort of setup. So it's really specific to the species of seaweed.
Hannah, there was actually a question about dulse and whether there is dulse in Maine.
Oh yeah, there is. Oh my gosh, I know. I didn't find any in my little walks that I took in preparation for this talk, which I'm bummed about because dulse is so gorgeous. But yes, there is dulse in Maine. You definitely will find it the farther and farther down east you get, and also where there's higher and higher wave energy, not ultra high wave energy like, points of land, but just in from there. So of course I work at Schoodic, and you can find a lot of dulse out on the far side of Little Moose Island if you go out, of course staying on the rocks and being courteous of the plants that live out there. There's some nice dulse out there.
Awesome. I think we have one last question queued up here, and then maybe we'll wrap things up. This has been so great. Thank you for your extra time, Hannah.
Sure.
Are individual seaweeds male, female, or both?
Gosh, species dependent. So Ascophyllum nodosum, rockweed, has male and female alga. So the males release sperm and the females release eggs during reproductive periods, but the fucoids, the fucus species, don't have male and female. So it's really species dependent. Some do, some don't.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Hannah. That was awesome.
Yeah. Thank you guys, and thank you all. And do we hang up now? How does this end?
Yeah, we can wrap it up.
All right.
But just so everyone knows, to tune in next Thursday, we have Hannah. Would you like to give a little intro to next week? I mean, Leander, I'm sorry.
Sure.
I'm like, I know it's about fire. I could tell you that much.
Exactly. Yeah, it's another great webinar. It's with the Nature Conservancy of Maine. And the Director of Land Management is going to be presenting on fire management techniques for ecological balance. And that's June 18th at 4 p.m. So if you're interested, please register for that. And thank you so much again for being here this evening. And thank you, Hannah. That was really, really wonderful.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you, Hannah.
Have a good one, guys. Bye-bye.
Night.
Bye.